Hi, I'm Bill Arnold. Thank you for listening to this podcast. There are many more podcasts available at myfaithradio.com. Your support makes this possible. Thank you. Okay, it's time to begin. Let's start a countdown. 20, 19, 18, 17. I just start the song.
Oh, don't you know, it's the Bill Arnold Show. It's Bill.
Us as believers, we're always looking for guidance on how to be honoring to God with our finances and resources, and yet there's so much going on in the world right now. There's this, inflationary concerns. We've got AI crashing in. There's all kinds of concern about our employment and all of that. So we're going to talk to John Coleman. He's an investor, he's an author, he's a speaker, and he loves that intersection of faith, purpose, and finance. His book is called Good Money, 6 Steps to Building a Financial Life with Purpose. John, thanks for coming on the show today.
Yeah, Bill, such a pleasure to be with you all today.
Thanks. Did your parents tell you to save your money?
They did teach me to save my money, although sometimes the lessons didn't go much beyond that. But I was fortunate at least to get the basics, and I've been learning ever since, which was one of the reasons for writing the book, to keep on learning about it.
And did you learn at a very young age about the value of giving and the value of being generous?
Yeah, I did. And Bill, like many of your listeners, probably the earliest lessons I got from that were through the church. So I grew up going to a Protestant church. I was really raised to think that my faith was important and taught from a very young age about the benefit of tithing, particularly in church. It was limited as it often is for believers. That was my earliest lessons were really about tithing to the church. But over time, that really spread to serving others, to volunteering, and to thinking about generosity more broadly. But I would say it's only been in recent years since I started working in this faith-driven investing space and meeting families who are extraordinarily generous that my own mind has been open to the breadth of generosity that's possible, financial and otherwise. And so it's been a long journey for me over the course of my life.
Great answer. We all have such a unique relationship with money, and I don't know why that is, but your book is entitled Good Money. So let my first question be, what is good money?
Yeah, I think one of the fundamental premises is that money can be good or bad. And I think any Christian believer has an intuitive sense of that. The Bible mentions money 2,350 times or so. And not all of those references are bad. God blessed some people with extraordinarily financial wealth that they used to help others, whether that be Abraham or David or even some figures in the New Testament. But many of those verses are cautionary tales. Famously, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And so the question for me is, if money is just a tool, it can be a blessing that God bestows on someone to help steward and help benefit others, as the parable of the talents might show, or other references that Jesus makes. But it can also be uniquely tempting in a way that very few things are. And so the question in my mind is, how do we start to view money not as a goal, but as a means to an end? And then how do we define that end with human flourishing in such a way that money supports positive outcomes for people, purpose, meaning, community, relationships, serving others, rather than something that can lead us astray? And I think good money is one that enables the good life, and learning to incorporate that into all of the areas of our financial lives, spending, giving, earning, investing, saving, is one way we can shape money so that it can benefit the ultimate aims that we have as believers or non-believers alike, to live a good life and create human flourishing in ourselves and others.
Mm-hmm. John, I like that you said that money is a means, not an end. So let's try to use that mindset. How should we as Christians approach earning money and spending money?
Yeah, earning is the very heart of what we do, right? So I talk about those 4 levers: earning, spending, giving, and investing is the 4 ways we touch money. And earning is one of the only ways it comes in. Investing, it kind of goes out and in. And some of the most discouraging statistics I see today are about the number of people in our society who are earning just for a paycheck and who aren't earning with purpose, right? We spend a plurality of our time at work, often 30, 40, 50, 60 hours a week. And yet, if you look at surveys on the amount of engagement people get at work, only around 15% of people globally are engaged at work. And in no country in the world do people rate their work as a significant source of meaning and purpose in their life. In the United States, in fact, only around 17% of people say that their work is a meaningful source of purpose in their life. And so, one of the mindset shifts I encourage people to take is that there is no success without significance. That even if you manage to be financially successful at work, if that work isn't edifying for you, if it's not helpful to others, if it's not something that's driving purpose and meaning in your life, the financial benefits of it are very incomplete. And that's one of the things that leads us to feel so disengaged, disconnected from work. And I talk through some of the ways in which you can address that: crafting your work, treating it as a craft, serving others, building relationships at work, etc. The spending side, similarly, is uniquely tempting. And this is where the Bible often cautions directly or indirectly quite a lot. And I think we get such mixed messages in society today. If you watch TikTok or Instagram, there are people with fancy cars or watches, waving around piles of cash, equating their identity with the stuff that they buy. And yet, the best research out there right now from Elizabeth Dunn and others shows that spending money on stuff is actually not that good for happiness. There were famous studies about earning where Angus Deaton and Daniel Kahneman showed that above a certain threshold in life, about $105,000 today in income, there's not a meaningful gain in happiness to income. And indeed, when you talk about spending, the acquisition of stuff is as likely to make us dissatisfied as satisfied. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is, well, what are the categories of spending that actually do make us satisfied? And it's things like experiences, experiences that you do with others, for example, do give you lasting happiness and fulfillment. It's things like health, where you're improving your mental, spiritual, or physical health, which is a key component of human flourishing. Or it's things like relationships themselves, where you're investing in building community with others, which we as Christians know is very central to both the Christian life and individual fulfillment. And so, in both categories, I think we've been led astray by popular culture and by society, but there are ways in which we can seek to approach earning and spending that better align the income and the use of money with what it takes for us to be happy and fulfilled.
Oh, well said, John. I remember that old chestnut that goes something like people spend money they don't have to buy things they don't need to impress people they don't like.
That's right. That's right. And it's something that not only makes us unhappy, but it's behind all the consumer debt that we see in society right now. You know, people just practically get themselves in dire financial straits doing exactly what you described, spending money they don't have on things they don't need to impress people they don't like. I love that formulation. And it's shocking today, the trillions of dollars in credit card debt, trillions of dollars in auto debt, student loans, other things where we buried ourselves under a mountain of financial obligations that actually restrict the ways in which we can use our finances moving forward. And we often do that on things that don't yield any real benefit for us, which is something that people can address if they change their mindsets around spending and money.
My guest is John Coleman, and his book is called Good Money: 6 Steps to Building a Financial Life with Purpose. And John, I'm curious for you to give us some of your perspective on how important gratitude is in our financial mindset. If we're going to have a financial mindset that's going to be biblical, talk about how important gratitude is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the beautiful things that I've found, so this book is for Harvard Business Review. It's written for mainstream audiences, but I'm consistently pleased with the amount of alignment between modern social science research and what we've learned through the Christian religious tradition. And as a believer, of course, we should always be enthusiastic about new research because we think that our faith has something of truth in it and that all of that research will lead to truth. And indeed, as you go chapter by chapter in this book, you'll find that the modern research all supports a very Christian conception of how to use money. Gratitude is right at the center of it. If you look at social science research today, People who live gratefully often experience extraordinary benefits to their own mental and physical health. They live longer, they have lower incidence of disease, they have less psychological problems. They tend to experience greater purpose and meaning. This focus on what we have and being content with it is actually one of the key mindsets that we can embrace, such that we're not constantly obsessed with more and more and more, which is a very dangerous path, but instead focus on what we've been gifted and how we can use that for the benefit of others. And that gratitude, both within religious tradition, as we know, as well as in the social science research, is very clear. God constantly tells us when we're praying, for example, to lead with gratitude, to thank God for the gifts that we've been given, even in difficult circumstances. We can see that in the Lord's Prayer, for example, where we're grateful for our daily bread, for the things that God provides. And that's really an anchoring spiritually and psychologically in this idea that we have been gifted all that we have, and we don't need to be discontent and constantly wanting more. And once we encounter that mindset, it eliminates the scarcity that sometimes drives us towards greed or towards constant acquisition, which are very fruitless paths.
John, what are some bad money mindsets? And I hope I don't have any.
We all have a few, unfortunately.
Okay. All right.
And there are bad money mindsets, and then I would say there are just some incomplete money mindsets where people are not behaving maliciously, but they've never really thought through something. I'd start with identity. One bad money mindset that very few people would admit, but many of us embrace implicitly, is that my worth is based on my net worth, right? That money actually defines who I am, that if I have more money, that will make me a better person. And of course, if we reflect on that, even saying that out loud, many people would shy away from that. And yet the way that we live is that way. Money is a clear scoreboard. It's a scorecard. So many things in life are difficult to measure, but your net worth isn't. And many people begin to conflate their net worth with their worth. And indeed, some of the more malicious parts of the internet or other areas of society say that very explicitly. I saw an influencer, one of these male influencers online, talking very explicitly about how he was a better man because he was richer, because he had all these things. And yet, if we look at the stories of the people we admire most, from Mother Teresa to Billy Graham, there was nothing about their identity that we appreciated that had anything to do with money. It was about the centeredness that they had in their own spiritual life, the work that they were doing for others. And so I think reversing that identity and disassociating worth and net worth is an important flip of a bad money mindset. One of those incomplete bad money mindsets that I touch on is that we keep our finances away from our kids, right? Often we shield kids from financial decisions. We don't apprentice them in the proper management of money. And then they end up leaving the household without a real conception of how to earn well, give well, spend well, invest well. They can't practically manage a budget, but even more so, their values aren't fully formed. And so one of the things I advocate is that we take up financial apprenticeship of our children very early. And this is one of the things my wife and I learned in the course of writing this book. We were starting this, but there were practices around things like giving as a family, introducing our kids to charity, to what we're doing philanthropically, and encouraging them to do their own, making that a family decision that's been really edifying to building in a culture of generosity in the kids. The same with investing, where we just shielded kids from what we were doing in our portfolio. But at the right ages, we're starting now to include them in that, to give them small pools of money that they're investing themselves so they can begin to learn those lessons earlier. And I think it's a bad money mindset to shield kids from money, and a better money mindset to start introducing them as early as 4 or 5 to basic concepts about it, and then really trying to apprentice them more thoroughly as they age and grow into independence. So those are just 2 that I would highlight, although there are many more in the book and many more we could discuss.
Mm-hmm. You are a smart, likable guy. We're going to take a break. John Coleman is my guest. His book is called Good Money, 6 Steps to Building a Financial Life with Purpose. We'll be right back. We carry each other's burdens. Please know you can bring us your prayer concerns and we will pray. Share your prayer requests with the Faith Radio team by texting or calling 877-933-2484, or share your prayer requests with the Faith Radio staff and listeners at myfaithradio.com. I'm back with John Coleman. His book is called Good Money, 6 Steps to Building a Financial Life with Purpose. All right, John, in the last segment, we were talking about identity, which is an important thing in everyone's life. And I pray that everyone's identity is in Christ and in Christ alone, although we do get caught up from time to time trying to measure ourselves by the kinds of vacations we go on or the houses we live in or the cars we drive. You said that, and I don't disagree. So in a culture that's driven by a lot of materialism, coach us as to how believers can resist this pressure to define ourselves by what we own, what's in the driveway.
Yeah, one of the simplest but most difficult to implement practices, because it feels so challenging for people sometimes, is this idea of setting a financial finish line. So, as I mentioned before, we are wired to want more. There's a psychological concept embedded within human beings called hedonic adaptation, which means once we get something good, we quickly become dissatisfied with it and want more. You and I may have encountered this, right? We get a new car and we love it for a little while, but then we start to look around and see a better car that we dream about, that we'd love to get. The same with a house, or even something simple like a piece of furniture or a gadget. That's hedonic adaptation. People adapt to their circumstances very quickly. They become that normal becomes the new normal instead of something good, and then they want more. And this shows up in the way that people think about money. There was a great Harris poll not too long ago where they asked people at all income levels how much income annually would be enough for you to feel happy and fulfilled. And the answer at every single level was just a little bit more. If you ask someone with $40,000 a year in income, they might say $50,000 or $60,000. If you ask someone with $250,000 a year in income, they'd say $350,000. And so the idea that we'll ever be satisfied is an illusion, right? That never stops. One way to counteract that is to decide upfront what amount of money is necessary for you to live a comfortable lifestyle, for a lifestyle that suits your needs. And instead of constantly chasing a new lifestyle as you become wealthier, to set that limit and then use any income or net worth beyond that to engage in charitable causes, to give to others, to build a business, other things that don't increase our lifestyle and short circuit this desire that we have to constantly want more. I have a business partner, for example, who set a financial finish line very early in his career, which is often the best time to do it, before you've had a chance to get addicted to more and more acquisition or to see lifestyles that are further and further out of reach. And he ended up building this very successful business that within 4 or 5 years, he had reached the net worth target he had for his financial finish line, the savings he would need to live on an income every year that would keep them comfortable. And he followed through with that, and he built a multi-billion-dollar business enterprise, but ended up giving away 99.9% of that, either reinvesting it in the business to grow it, to create flourishing in those companies, or standing up a foundation, which is where all the profits of that business go and where ultimately the ownership of that business is. And that's a radical example that most people would shy away from. But if we set a financial finish line, if we determine in advance how much is enough, we free ourselves from constantly asking, hey, what would a little more look like? What would a bigger house look like? What would more houses look like? Which is the trap so many people fall into as they get wealthier. And so I think that's one of the better, simple, practical steps that most people could take is sit down with a financial advisor, figure out what lifestyle you need to support and what that means in annual income. And once you've hit that, once you've achieved it, think about what good you can do with those finances beyond your own personal consumption. And that's not the way most people think, but it's certainly a way of short circuiting our continuously acquisitive mindsets and reorienting towards generosity and towards gratitude, which you mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm. You know, I have to smile when I think of a guy like Warren Buffett, who has pretty much bottomless resources, and he's been living in the same 4-bedroom rambler in Omaha for the last 40 years.
That's right. Yeah. And and he does it because he loves what he does. He's obviously been quite charitable. Warren Buffett's not a believer, but in some ways he's reflecting a Christian mindset better than many Christians, right? And that he has not focused on his personal consumption or lifestyle, but simply on how do I use my talents for their greatest impact around the world? And then how do I give the excess to others in a way that can help society flourish. And that's a really inspiring example.
Mm-hmm. Because you talk about in your book, you talk about simplicity and satisfaction. Now, I don't know how simple and satisfied a guy like Warren Buffett is, but I know he drives through McDonald's in the morning to get his little cheese sandwich, his cheese and egg sandwich, which I find kind of entertaining. But how do we as believers pursue contentment? Because I think contentment is a really big word, and I try to use it often. People say, "How are you?" And I try to say, "I'm pretty content," because I think it's a disturbing answer to people. What do you mean? And it just gives me an opportunity to have more conversation. Because
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, speaking to what you touched on earlier, speaking to an explicitly Christian audience, the first is setting your identity in Christ. I
Amen.
think you nailed it
Yeah.
by saying that. If you're anchored in the fact that you're a sinner redeemed by grace, that there's a God of the universe who cares not just about humanity, but about you individually, and that every person here, including you, is possessed of inherent dignity and worth, so much so that God would come down to earth and sacrifice himself to build a relationship with you, that centering of identity is where contentment starts in my mind. And I think it's much more difficult, honestly, if you don't have access to that truth. But once you're anchored in that, all of the other things we do to seek identity or contentment become very secondary. Now, some of those are important. One of the things I find as a parent or as a husband is a lot of my happiness is really predicated on, are my kids thriving? Is my wife thriving? Am I being a good husband and dad? And I think that's a good outlet. That can be abused, that can be misused, that can take priority over God, which would be bad. But in general, people aspiring to be a better husband, friend, father, mother, brother or sister, son or daughter, that's a really positive way in which we seek to get better, not out of discontentment, but out of love, right? Which is an orientation that's different than discontentment. Where we fall into traps is when we think our contentment will come from things that we possess. The Bible teaches us that life is but a vapor, right? That we won't take anything with us. Ecclesiastes, for example, among other places, is very good at articulating that wealth is ultimately fruitless, that it doesn't lead to happiness. It's just a tool. There's nothing inherently worthy about it, right? The only thing worthy about it is what we do with it to have a positive impact on others. And for Christians, that means in accordance with our faith, with sharing the gospel, with loving other people extraordinarily well. And I think if we anchor on that central identity, then we become much more content with our circumstances, knowing that God has a plan for us, that we can use our talents for his purposes. And we don't chase discontentment or identity in things that are unlikely to build it, whether that's admiration or power or the acquisition of financial wealth or the acquisition of showy things. We learn that those are ultimately fruitless, and that really a relationship of love to God and to others is the source of all contentment in life. And money is just a way in which we can try and emphasize those things, loving God and loving others well.
Mm-hmm. John Coleman is my guest. His book is called Good Money. When you were talking earlier about just feeling purposeful with what you're doing in your work, let's talk a little bit about how work is a calling. I always think that you can bring dignity to any job, and sometimes I see people who might be bagging groceries who do it well with a great attitude, and I'm thinking, man, sometimes I admire how well you do your job and how much you seem to care. So you really can bring dignity to any job and give God the glory and treat each job you have as an act of worship to him.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. I actually wrote a prior book with HBR called The HBR Guide to Crafting Your Purpose, which was mostly about building purpose at work. And Bill, you touched on the central thesis, which is any job has inherent dignity and worth. Any job that has good purposes. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
if you were a drug trafficker or something, that would not be a good outlet for your talents. But the vast majority of things, whether it's a bus driver, a cashier, or a teacher, or an investment banker, can be oriented towards good purposes. And I spend a lot of that book, and I touch on it in this book, laying out simple ways in which we can take whatever job we have today and try and make it more meaningful. I believe you craft purpose into the work that you have rather than just seeking out work that's inherently meaningful. You may find that, but really it's our job to endow everything that we do with purpose. And that's a liberating concept because it means we don't have to find a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It means we don't have to be paralyzed by wondering if there's something better that we could be doing. And instead, we can just focus on doing what we do incredibly well and crafting meaning into that. I highlight four simple practices in good money that people can take to work. The first of those is what I call crafting your work, which is based on the management philosophy of something called job crafting. And that's where you take the job you have and make it the job you want. One of the most famous studies on this was from a Yale researcher who followed hospital janitors, basically. And she sought to understand what made those who were happy, happy, and what made those who were disengaged, disengaged. And she found that those who were happiest were those who viewed themselves as part of a care team for the patients in the hospitals, not merely as executing the task of janitors.
Mm.
They moved around pictures on the walls of long term patients, hoping that that could bring beauty to their stay. So they'd shift the paintings around. They experimented with different cleaning fluids to see which would be least irritating to those who are in long term care. They really became a part of the medical team, investing in the flourishing of those individuals, going well beyond their job description. And that helped to make their work more meaningful. And I think almost all of us could look for ways to craft our work to make it more meaningful, to make it invest in others. The second is what I call making work a craft, kind of a play on words between the two. And that's this old concept of just whatever you do, doing it with excellence. Run the race as if to win it, as you just mentioned. And whether you're a carpenter or a consultant or an auditor, you have the ability to get deep meaning and purpose from pushing yourself to be as good at what you do as anybody can be, to maximize your talents. And we get an inherent sense of purpose and meaning from self improvement and from really executing a job well. And yet, many people are caught just punching a clock, not pursuing that excellence, not knowing that could give them a great sense of fulfillment. The other two practices that I focus on, one is service to others. I believe in any job, there are at least 5 or 6 different categories of people that we can be serving. It's clients or customers, it's colleagues. How can we invest in and serve the people that we work with? It's our community more broadly. How can we, as individual citizens, as part of a corporation, serve the communities in which we're embedded? It's the partners with whom we work, vendors, suppliers, et cetera. We as Christians have an opportunity to show the gospel, show the light of God to each of those people every day. And we as professionals have an opportunity to serve them in ways that make their lives better. Like that cashier that you mentioned who says, have a nice day, and who asks you about your day and lifts your spirits in that moment.
Hmm.
That's a way of serving others in your work. And then the final is to build positive relationships. So if you look at the social science research, the number one way in which most people achieve happiness and fulfillment in life is the depth and breadth of their positive relationships. And yet often we get sucked into either not having relationships at work or having negative relationships. And I think all of us who work around people every day, through serving others, have an opportunity to invest in relationships with those people and to cultivate positive, meaningful relationships in the workplace. And I think if you do those four things, that's a start to helping make almost any job that you're in more meaningful and purposeful and edifying for you.
Hmm. Well said, John Coleman. We're going to take a little break, and Wyatt will purposefully and meaningfully take us to a short break, and we'll be right back with John Coleman. He's the author of Good Money, 6 Steps to Building a Financial Life with Purpose. We'll be right back. All right, John, here's my next question for you, because I know tithing is a big deal. Many Christians tithe, but let's talk about giving wisely. What does that mean?
Yeah, so I think the first step for people is just being generous. I talk about giving wisely, which is a framework or a couple of frameworks for how we can give better, how we can make sure our generosity actually has its intended impact on the world around us and is something that's very edifying for us. But the first step is simply to give, because people get hung up on that. The United States by GDP is the most generous nation in the world, and yet only 2% of our GDP every year goes towards philanthropy. In many countries, that's less than 1%. As many as 4 in 10 Americans today give nothing at all during the course of the year. And yet, if you look at the research, let's say you were just self interested instead of commanded by God to be generous, all of the research points to one of the 2 or 3 most important ways in which we can be happy and fulfilled in life being generosity for others. And that starts at a very elemental level in us. There was a great study, for example, where they looked at toddlers as young as 2, and they gave these kids a treat. And they then asked them if they'd like to give it to a puppet who was in the room with them or if they'd like to consume it themselves. And they found that those toddlers were happier giving their treat to a puppet than they were consuming it themselves. We are hardwired
Hmm.
to love generosity, and yet many of us haven't unlocked that. Um, I think once you've decided to be generous, you should pre-commit to giving. And this is one of what I call the 4 Ps of wiser generosity that I could just touch on. Pre-commitment is a powerful psychological concept where instead of trying to make decisions on the fly, we decide ahead of time that we want to do something, which takes all of the difficulty of decision away,
Hmm.
right? That means that instead of wondering, should I give this year? Should I give at the end of the year? We already say, hey, I think 10% of my income off the top should go immediately to charity. I think 20% should, 25% should. In our household, for example, we do that through a donor advised fund. So every month when my income comes in, a percentage of that is taken and put into my DAF before I can touch it with anything else. And if there's unexpected income bonuses, et cetera, we obviously carve out a percentage of that as well. And so we know off the top we can't spend that money, right? So it takes all of the decision making out of that. And I think that's a powerful tool, which is why tithing, I think, was one of the concepts in the Bible. Just get people accustomed to giving their first fruits to God and sharing those with others. Um, the 4 Ps that I highlight in the book, the one associated with pre-commitment is what I call percentage giving. So the first step in my mind is to say, I'm not going to just ad hoc give to charities in the grocery line, though that may have a point to it. I want to say, I'm going to dedicate the first fruits of what I make to generosity towards others. And that's going to restrict how I spend and invest. I'm going to build around that. And pre-committing to be a percentage giver is a big part of that. The second is to find something you have a passion about. Again, giving to something in the grocery line or when a friend calls you about a charity event may have its purpose. But if you want to be unusually generous, if you want to be the type of person like many I know who are giving not 10%, but 20% or 50% or 90% of their income, you really want to find things about which you specifically are passionate about, whether that's evangelism, whether that's homelessness, combating human trafficking. Each of us is wired for something different. And that's great because there are tons of worthy causes in the world that require each of us to be passionate. The third in my mind is to participate in that cause. So I tell people all the time, don't just be financially generous. Generosity that stops with a paycheck is incomplete generosity. Jesus calls us to serve, not just to give, but to be hands-on. So if your cause is homelessness that you give to, go serve in the homeless shelter, serve in the soup kitchen, serve on the board of homeless community. If you love building housing for people, go serve on a Habitat for Humanity site after you've given to Habitat for Humanity. And that participation connects our financial generosity with personal generosity. And then the fourth piece of advice I'd have is to partner with others. And this was a great learning for me. I had often done my giving quietly. And in fact, the Bible tells us to give quietly. And yet sometimes I think sharing at least with a small group of people about generosity helps us to build generosity in relationship. It holds us accountable to being generous. And that may start as small as the family level. As I mentioned before on a segment, we've started the practice of drawing our kids into charity. Some of them are too young to know exactly how much we give. We don't want them getting distracted by the numbers, but we talk them through what we give to, and we give them a portion of capital at the end of every year around Christmas from us to give to others. And then they're allowed to take some of their own personal money that they made through chores and others and give it to something, and then we'll 10x that amount for them. So if they give $100, we'll make that $1,000 to the charity of their course, that they're focused on. And I think that partnership as a family embeds generosity more deeply in each of us. and holds us accountable to one another. Now my kids are asking, what are we giving to? Who are we trying to help? What has been the outcome of that? And as parents, that holds us incredibly accountable to keep it up, to make sure that we're still engaged with those charities. That may be your friend group, it may be a financial advisor, it may be a group that you're doing philanthropy with, but doing it in partnership can be incredibly impactful.
You and your wife must love seeing that in your children.
Oh, it's awesome. And the funny thing about it, Bill, is kids, any parent of kids knows what I'm about to say is not negative. Kids are simultaneously the most selfish and the most unselfish human beings in the world. Right?
Yeah.
You give my kids a bag of candy and they suddenly become very selfish sometimes with their siblings. um, but when you introduce this idea of generosity, like we were talking about, um, we pre-selected 5 charities for them to give to at the end of the year because we didn't want to leave it too open-ended, but we talked them through what those could be and just asked them, what are you passionate about? What resonates with you the most? Um, one of those was a medical charity. My daughter has a complex medical condition that we give to. And my oldest son, for his little sister, said, I want to give everything in my ledger, which is, we have a ledger system for keeping track of their finances. He said, I just want to give it all to this charity to help people like my little sister.
Oh, my.
And we actually had to tell him we weren't going to let him do that. Maybe that was bad parenting. We said, John White, we love that. We love the spirit that you're bringing to that. We're gonna let you keep some of your money, and we're just going to amplify through our own giving what you would have done otherwise. But it was this remarkable moment for both he and his sister, where you could see the fact that he loved her so much was driving this generosity, and he had no regard for his personal resources. And to think, as adults, it's almost inconceivable that we would see someone in need and say, we're giving everything to that person. He did it without a blink, right? And it was just this wonderful reminder that sometimes kids, they haven't learned that they need to be afraid of financial insecurity. They haven't learned that there's tons of stuff they need to buy. And in that, they can underestimate their responsibilities, but there's a remarkable open-heartedness about that we as adults sometimes forget. And all he cared about was seeing the improvement of others with the resources that he'd accumulated. And that, honestly, I mean, when my wife and I were proud of him, we loved seeing that between he and his sister. But it was also something that inspired us and said, man, are we really doing enough? I mean, if he's willing to give everything, is the percentage we're giving enough? And we saw that echoed through all the kids, that different charities. Homelessness was one of the charities that we chose. One daughter chose to give everything to the church because it was so supportive of kids like her, and she just wanted people to know the gospel. They each picked different things, but their heart mindset was the same. And every single kid, all 4 of them, gave far more than we had asked them to give. They gave multiples, so much so that actually 3 of the 4 kids, we had to cap their giving because we didn't want them to give away everything that they had. And it was just a passion for generosity that some of us have lost.
Oh, it's beautiful. Let's talk about generosity and how I know it brings joy to people, and it does reflect God's character. This is a 2-part question, John. So that's a given. Let's talk about that. But then also let's talk about the people listening right now who their money's so tight they can't be generous. As a matter of fact, they hope someone is generous to them.
Yeah, 100%. And one thing I'll preface here is I've written Good Money primarily for those who have what they need, right? There are different guidelines that are helpful to people living paycheck to paycheck. There are different tools to deal with poverty. And I remind readers in my book, no matter if there are problems that come with wealth and temptations that come with wealth, it's always harder to be poor than to be rich. When I was born, my dad was a rodeo cowboy. Actually, my mom cut hair. We lived in a single wide trailer in Florida. And, our focus at that time was primarily on getting by, surviving. My dad thought of others, but the 2 others he was thinking about the most were my mom and myself, right? Just making sure that we had enough to eat. And to the people in those situations, I'd say generosity is still important. There's a great story about the widow and her mite in the New Testament where Jesus sees a widow putting in the smallest, mite was the smallest unit of currency at that time that you could give, basically like a penny or 2. But it was she was in such financial distress that he said that gift of a penny or 2 was more impactful than the large gifts of the wealthy around him because it was everything that she could muster. And so one thing I'd encourage even those living paycheck to paycheck, if you can't give money, if you can serve, if you can just take a moment to serve others, if you can give a little, even a dollar or two, if that's all you can spare, but unlock that part of generosity in your heart, because it's what Jesus commands, and he views that act of generosity greater than anything I'm doing, greater than anything someone wealthier than me is doing, because it is coming from a place of emptiness, but still looking to fill up others. Um, and I would say beyond that, those of us with resources, those reading this book, the people that actually have desperate needs, single moms, widows and orphans, people who have suffered terrible abuse, those who are growing up in poverty and need better educations. That is precisely why generosity is so important, so that we can create an environment where others can flourish as well as ourselves. I talked to a great researcher at Harvard called Tyler Vanderweel. He leads the Harvard program on human flourishing. I interview him in the book. He's a Christian as well. And he talks about the idea that human flourishing can't happen if it's only individual flourishing, that true flourishing only happens in community and only when communities are flourishing. And so if you live in a neighborhood or a town or a city or a country where you're doing well, but the people around you are suffering, you are not truly living to the best of your God given ability, and you're not experiencing the true freedom that God would have for us. And so I think that commandment for generosity is universal, even those for whom, life is constrained. I remember as a kid living in that trailer park, I was very young, but my parents invested some of the other kids and teenagers in the park, gave them food when they needed food, helped them. And that was one of the starkest examples of generosity I can remember, because it was them giving things they barely had, right? And yet God looks on that kind of gift even more lovingly, I think, than he looks on it from someone who has excess resources.
All right, John, we're going to take a break. Money might have been tight for you growing up, but you did get free haircuts, so that's got to be worth something.
That's right.
Yeah. The name of his book is Good Money, 6 Steps to Building a Financial Life with Purpose. John Coleman is my guest. We'll be right back. It is my deepest desire that you take the very first step of faith by placing your faith and trust in Jesus Christ. If you've got questions about what it means to begin a relationship with Jesus, text the word faith to 41224. My guest is John Coleman. His book is Good Money. It's been a great conversation, John. You say in your book, and you urge us to save for freedom, not retirement. What does that mean?
This is the one the publisher thinks is going to be most controversial, Bill. I fundamentally disagree with the modern conception of retirement. I think there's no biblical justification for it, and there's little scientific support for the idea of retirement, at least the way we define it, leaving a job and engaging in a life of pure leisure, this ideal of going and sitting on the beach all day or playing golf. I think that's fundamentally bad for people and different than what God calls us to do. And so what I say instead is what people want is not a life of pure leisure. That's dissatisfying on multiple fronts. What they want is the freedom, the agency, the autonomy in order to work in a way that they feel is most impactful. We talked about people living hand to mouth previously.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're having to clean hotel rooms or do other things that are very difficult, you may want to do something else, and that might be entirely justified. But I think this idea of retiring is misplaced. And so what I encourage people to do is actually set financial goals where they have the financial flexibility to pursue the use of their talents in the most impactful way. The science right now that I list in the book, mortality goes up when you retire. So if you retire even 1 year later, your chance of mortality goes down something like 20 to 30%. Incidence of stroke, heart attack go down. Social isolation goes down if you delay retirement or if you don't fully retire. Even if you're just leaving a job to engage in volunteer work consistently or taking a lower paying job that has more impact, even if you're reining in hours, that can help you not only be healthier, not only be mentally and physically more stable, but it can help you use your talents in a way that's edifying and purposeful. And so I'm really on a quest to get people thinking very differently about retirement, to view their financial savings not as the point at which they can just leave work and do nothing forever and engage in leisure, whatever that number is, but to set a number that will allow them the freedom and agency to pursue whatever that best use of their talents is for others. That might, look like reduced hours. I don't think any of us wants to work as hard at 80 as we do at 25. At some point, physical health may cause us to leave the workplace, and I'm not judging that at all. But I think we should always be thinking not about how can we spend more time on ourselves, but how can we use the talents God has given us most effectively to be most purposeful and fulfilled, and also to invest in others.
John, let's talk about how Christians, how can Christians think about the future and not fall into feeling full of fear, or I've got to kind of live in a survival mode or self-protection?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first of that is theological, right? Which is
Right.
Jesus notes that God made us, and if he takes care of the sparrow in the fields, he obviously is going to take care of and care about us. And we always have hope that even if this current temporal life is difficult, that as long as we're faithful, as long as we encounter truth, that God has reached out and made it possible for us to live a perfect eternal life with him. And so I think the first thing, which is so simple to say and so difficult to do, is that Christians should always endeavor not to be anxious, to not be overcome by worry or fear, because ultimately we serve a God who's in control, who's already conquered sin and death, and he has a plan for us, right? And that plan may include difficulties, it may include suffering here on earth. There are many biblical stories about that, but ultimately we don't have to be anxious because we know where our hope lies, right? Now, in the practical realities of day to day, that's difficult. As a dad, I worry about my wife. I worry about my kids. I want to give them a better future. And I think that's an appropriate thing to do, right? I think Christians should be prudent financial stewards. And some of those uses are quote unquote selfish in the sense that Christians should be worried about, hey, I'm going to save enough. I'm going to be financially prudent enough to have a house where my kids can grow up, to make sure they have a good education, to feed them, to take care of the needs of our family, and give them a better life than we had. I think we all aspire to that. Where I think it gets dangerous is when Christians think too much about temporal legacy rather than eternal legacy. And I think this is true even of people more broadly. Some of the research I encountered in the book that was it wasn't that surprising, but it was so interesting to see in the actual statistics, is sometimes when kids, for example, encounter too much wealth that's unearned or too sudden, it can be very destructive to them. So the children of wealthy people, for example, are more subject to substance abuse. They're more subject to feelings of purposelessness and meaninglessness. They find social relationships more difficult. And so often you see even Christians hoarding money, hoping to give giant trusts to their kids, to overwhelm them with wealth, which is their way of thinking through how do I give a better life to my kids, not understanding that that can actually be destructive. And so I really advocate that Christians and all people center themselves not in a conception of their net worth, but in a conception of the good life. In the book in a chapter on money and kids, we talk about setting a mission, vision, and values for your family that's anchored in what you believe to be true, and making that what you talk to your kids about more than specific financial targets. And then apprenticing your kids, for example, in both the prudent use of money, so how to earn, save, invest, to be responsible stewards of what you have, but to connect that to the values that you have. And indeed, I think a lot of the healthiest families that I've encountered are those that have limited dramatically what they give to their kids. I know one family that owns a multi-billion-dollar company, and they have given all of that company into a charitable trust. And the kids are allowed to work in the company and make a salary that's market rate, but they know they'll never inherit a vast amount of money. The only thing that they get to steward is the business and the giving that this family does on an annual basis. Wow. They all do it together and they give away a huge sum of wealth. But those kids are so well adjusted because they know they have to work for what they have, and their family's not letting them go destitute. But beyond their basic means, they're really oriented towards improving the lives of others, and it creates a much healthier spiritual and psychological mindset for them.
So interesting. John, thank you so much for doing the show. It's been a delight meeting you. I've learned a lot today.
Oh, thank you so much, Bill.
You
Such
bet.
a privilege to be on today.
John Coleman has been my guest. His book is called Good Money, 6 Steps to Building a Financial Life with Purpose. That wraps up our show for the day and for the week. Thank you for supporting Faith Radio. See you next week.
Thanks for listening. Programming like this is made available through your support. Information available at myfaithradio.com.
Coming this Easter, an epic 4-part audio podcast series, The Christ.
My hour has not yet come.
My son, your hour was written before time.
David Oyelowo.
He claims to be a king.
Tom Pelfrey.
My kingdom is not of this world.
Paul Walter Hauser.
He is the light, the true light.
John Rhys Davies and Patricia Heaton. The Christ, wherever you listen to podcasts.
There are moments in life when you don't know what comes next.
In one moment, everything changed.
And in those moments, people discover something unexpected.
That's the moment that the color came back in the room. It was literally like a light switch went on.
On the Wow God Stories podcast, you'll hear true stories of real people.
We start calling out on the Lord.
Wow God Stories, wherever you get your podcasts, and at myfaithpodcasts.com.